Well, good morning, shipmates. How are you? Good morning. We've rested up, and it is, oh, my watch says it's today. Aren't we lucky to be here? My name again is Richard Heyman. I'm a U.S. Merchant Marine Officer and have traveled around the world more times than I can remember, and I've been coming to Africa for many years. And I actually came on this ship, but I worked once on the Harmony, which maybe some of you remember. So I've been coming on Crystal now, sometimes over the years for about 20 years. But Africa is, of course, a destination for those who have already traveled extensively and want a bit more adventure in comfort here. By the way, I'm traveling with my son, Robin, who's there in the back. Hello, Robin. So you can see us around the ship, and we'd be happy to join you for a drink or a talk or any questions. Again, the lecture schedule is pretty tight, so I'll make this presentation and I'll be out. There'll be another talk here, but I'm happy to talk about all these things that I'll mention as we go along. Well, we're going to Sao Tome and Principe, which is an unusual little country made of two little islands with other little islands. And someone was saying, why are we going to some island off into the ocean? Well, it's on the way to somewhere, I hear, and it's also a beautiful natural preserve. Now, we were just in Benin and in Ghana, and you could see how those countries have had the full impact of development and road construction and things like that, so that they're rather crowded, dusty places, as you saw the other day. But this is the contrast. This is a sort of become, they dub it the Galapagos of Africa, and so it's primarily become a tourism destination, especially for other Africans who are on the vast mainland, but they come here for a little peace and quiet, and that's what we're going to have when we go right down to that little island. That's Principe, Sao Tome. But Africa, of course, is vast. I'm sure many of you have been to various parts of it. Just by contrast, the landmass of Africa is more than both North and South America and Europe combined, and it is let's say the continent's so big you can't quite call it anything because there's so many contracts from Egypt down to South Africa, Madagascar to West Africa. And I believe some of you have been on since Barcelona all the way around. You went to Dakar and a few other places. Now we're in the true tropical zone, and the giant Congo forest and river system is nearby. When the Europeans first came down to this coast, they were impressed by the lushness of it, tropical, particularly after being around the bend of Morocco and all of the Sahel and the Sahara Desert. And then suddenly they came into a very tropical, lush environment. And this was a land of many settled peoples for thousands of years. And it had been traditionally a trading route from the north of Africa down to here. And it had been called the Gold Coast because this was a source of mining and gold. So for 1,000 or more years, there had been caravans coming across the Sahara to come down to the Gold Coast and barter different goods for the gold. And that was the great attraction that first happened. Then the slave trade took over that business, and now it's a mixed economy. But these old maps show you old names of the area. Now we're going down to there's Sao Tome in Portuguese, and we were just in Benin right there, and you can see that group. That's the major group in Ghana in this region, the Ashanti, who still have a king, and various places inland. This is Liberia, the Grain Coast, the Ivory Coast, and so this is the stuff of legend and conflict, and but it has an ancient past. The European colonial era lasted maybe 500 years, but now that is past. And so archaeologists have found more evidence of the ancient gathering of peoples, often on the edge of the desert, because the trading went to the north and south, and then these areas on the rivers were the conduit back then. Mande is the general name for many of the people on the coast where we've been in Uganda. That's a language group, actually. Otherwise, there are many other groups. They found many decades ago the only, let's say, masonry capital of the Mande era Ghana, as the name originally meant gold in Mande, so that was why it got the name Gold Coast. But there's very little archaeological evidence because everything was made out of wood and perishable materials. They didn't have the kind of tools to cut and build large. There are bigger ruins, of course, of ancient Africa in Zimbabwe, the great fortresses in Zimbabwe. Here they have found a lot of rock art and carvings that have this sort of symbology. This is actually Ashanti language, which had been studied, but it's still a vocal language. It's not a written language, but this is the symbology you see in some of the textiles and the artwork. And so when the Europeans first came here, they were surprised to see very strong kingdoms with military, advanced social structure. In this case, it's the women army of the Ashanti marching. And of course, what happened is that the Europeans came and conquered one group after the other, and most famously took the Benin bronzes and other gold items to museums, and those are now being returned in repatriation. But when the Portuguese came, they came around by sea. They didn't march inland. They were always looking for a fortress to be a trading post on their way to India and Asia. So the Portuguese Empire was sort of fueled by this great fantasy of the world as their oyster to open it. In Portuguese, they say, we are born in a small country and destined to die in the big world. So many of the Portuguese explorers went out and never came home, but they were always looking for the perfect island, and maybe Sao Tome is it. Otherwise, they settled in places like Goa or Nagasaki all around the world. And then they've defended what little they had until now. They have relinquished all of their territories, especially the big ones in Africa. But this is sort of the imaginary utopian island that they were always looking for. The difficulty of navigation, though, meant that if you leave Iberia and Mediterranean, come down, you can ride the coast of northwest Africa, and then you come into the southern currents and winds that blow you either ashore, like where we are, with a driving wind that you can't get away from if you're in a sail vessel. So the Portuguese, under Dias and Vasco da Gama, they developed what they call La Volta, which is to go out to by the Cabo Verde, the Cape Verde, and then go out to the middle of the Atlantic and go around. And that was the great navigational achievement that put Diaz in Cape Town and Vasco da Gama all the way to India. And that became the trade route for centuries until the Suez Canal was built. Along this coast, you'll see the old Portuguese fortresses. They're still there. They've changed hands between the British and the French and such, but this is one in Elmira, which is to the west of Accra. And it's still there as a national monument. But it's also a testament to the marching armies of the Europeans who came in. And in this French illustration, you can see how happy the people are to see, and the ones that were not so happy are also smiling. And so this is the heritage why you come to these countries, and they're Ghana speaks English, Benin speaks French. I mean, this is the educated literary language, and they all speak some of it in kind of a Creole, but then there are 20 languages in Benin alone, a small country, and then many dialects. So the nature of Africa is local and often multilingual. And but then the Europeans came to these little islands and saw how lush and prosperous they are, but they had things they had never seen on the beaches of Barcelona. Though I hear there's some of these in Barcelona, but they're not that hungry. And then the upland was reached by the river traffic. I think maybe some of you went on the trip to go see the houses on stilts on the river. I heard that was quite beautiful, up out of the traffic jam of our Cotonou where we just were. And so there's a life that was supported by the lushness of the land and the fruit and the mild weather. And to a lot of us it seemed too hot and muggy. That's just because we were wearing too much maybe. And I found this picture of up the river in Benin. I like this name of the boat here, the MS Responsibility. Well, and so there's a lot of local life, and out of the city you sort of run out of many literate people are only in the city, and so there's a backland that is still, let's say, in its traditional lifestyle, though there are, of course, many changes. The first of all is massive agriculture. These countries, after the gold trade and the slave trade, have now become agricultural exporters, particularly of cacao to make chocolate. And Sao Tome, they have plantations like this, which are dedicated to cacao and other foodstuffs. We saw them yesterday pounding cassava, the manioc, the root that has to be pounded and washed because it's poison if you just cook it and eat it. Curiously, it is a food that came like cacao for chocolate from the Amazon. So just think of what Africa or Europe or Asia would be without the Amazon food groups, not just the manioc, but also chilies, tomatoes, chocolate, all those things they serve here on board that we enjoy. But life was simpler back then before the global exchange of these foods. But in Ghana and Benin, they do have lush forests and waterfalls, some mountain ranges. We only had a brief time there, but if you traveled up from the coast, it begins to get more arid and turns into the Sahel, which is the borderline between the Sahara and the tropical areas, often defined by cliffs and valleys. And this is the area that's still in contest between the Islamic and the Christian or the animist peoples. And just last week, another Boko Haram militant group captured a school and held for ransom 130 children. And this is, makes the international headlines, but this has been a kind of a simmering conflict for centuries. But all these countries are now, they try to be secular and provide religious freedom such as you can in the midst of that historical division. Well, they still also have some of their local nobility and royalty. So this is the King Otumufua Ose Tutu of the Ashanti people. So he's a hereditary king and has his family and his network, though he's I wouldn't call him a constitutional monarch. They kept the local authorities, particularly under the British, so that they would administrate the territory. And so this particular ceremony that happened last year is where some of the gold pieces and also the old throne of the Ashanti king were repatriated from the British Museum, and they had a ceremony which was all big news down here that they're finally getting some of their treasures back. And the Benin bronzes are particularly important because they were taken by the British again, and what happened is the local people made copies of them and they make them in a shrine. Now they are planning to build a museum so it'll be open to the public to see the actual big bronzes from 1,000 to 500 years ago. And so this royalist local authority is somewhat vaunted now that, well, their power is maybe not what it used to be. But this is the famous Queen Njinga, who was a leader of her people in Angola, which is just near here. And she was famous for staring down and bargaining with the Portuguese when they first came. And so when the first Portuguese commanders came to meet the queen of the Agonga people, and this was on Angola, not on Sao Tome, they put a mat so she would sit on the floor, and meanwhile the Portuguese official was in the chair. And that was considered an insult, so she took it upon herself to have one of her accompanying attendees sit down or get on the floor so she could sit on their back and be eye level and above the Portuguese. And she don't do anything until you call Your Majesty the Queen of Angola. So she was sort of a famous figure. She also led an army and beat the Portuguese and drove them out of the mainland. They came to Sao Tome, and at the time it was an uninhabited island. And so that's why it's still sort of a preserve away from the troubles of the mainland, which is not far. Here's her statue in downtown Cotonou, if you saw that as you're driving on the trip. So this is a modern hero of the country. She actually lived to a full ripe age, and her daughter inherited the throne after her. So that's an indication of sort of a matriarchal society that is true in a lot of Africa. It may be what they call a matriarchy in the guise of the patriarchy. I mean, they may have a male king, but the women really run the show, especially in the markets. Well, this just happened last week. Some of the Benin palace guard decided that they'd take over, perhaps because they didn't get paid on time, which is the usual problem. One country after another in Africa seems to get set up with a constitution and an assembly and some freedoms, and then the military takes over because there's some scandal that suddenly the national treasury has been invested in a mansion in France and numbered bank account. So this happened, and then it was quickly, there was a bit of conflict, and then the ECOWAS, or the Economic Union of West Africa, and also the African Union, demanded that the coup d'etat be stopped and then restore the duly elected president. So we might have missed the port yesterday had they not settled this last week. And here's the newspaper saying President Talon reassures his people. And the traffic jam goes on, but these little countries are very proud. Now they are also members of these West African Union and the general association of the different African states. But the real problem is nobody wants to be subject to outside authority. The memory of colonialism was sort of what is in their mind. They don't want to have to report to some Pan-African headquarters in Nairobi or wherever, Lagos, Nigeria, somewhere. So these little countries try to stay independent, sometimes at the cost of military coups, or else, in this case, the French in Mali trying to suppress the Islamic militia up there. So this is history we all know. Back not too long ago, the French had much of West Africa, from Tunis all the way down to the Cameroon and such, the Belgian Congo, or the British territories, and this is Angola and Mozambique, which are Portuguese. So you can imagine a country like Angola, which is bigger than France, run by a few Portuguese officials, which didn't work out too well for them when in 1975 the Portuguese change of government relinquished the colonies. But whatever the map says of who owned what or where, the real fact of it is that there's so many different kinds of people, so many languages, that it's a crazy quilt, and that's why the European languages became the patois of the area. But you ask anybody in these countries, where are you from? And they'll usually identify themselves by their linguistic and tribal group. We are Yoruba, Idu, Ashanti, and as we go to East Africa, there are all kinds of Kikuyu. There's hundreds and hundreds of groups, and they still have that cultural identity. But that makes it a very hard place to govern, because there's always conflict and either jealousy or some violence between the groups. Just where we're going, I mean, this was Benin and Ghana and then here, but you can just see how many language groups and small little territories are there still, even though they have a colonial boundary which often cuts right through their territory and allies them with other groups that were not neighbors or friendly before. I mean, the worst case is in Rwanda with the Hutu and the Tutsi, who are mortal enemies, and they're trying to be together in a country. So in the 1960s, the policy of decolonialization meant that one country after the other gained their independence, again often using the boundaries of the colonies that did not match the demography of the area. And so here in the Sao Tome and Principe in 1975, again, that's when the Portuguese government decided to give up its colonies rather than lose the war that was very bitter in Angola and Mozambique. There was no military action in Sao Tome because it was just a little island. And then since then, the growth of Africa has been very uneven. Some places are poorer than before, some places are better. Angola there has a GDP rise of 5%, which is a lot for a country, but that's almost all with their oil exploration and their trade. There's no oil in Sao Tome. And then, other countries are up or down, but the real problem of much of it is that the Sahara Desert is slowly but surely drying out all the Sahel, which is the borderline between the desert and the tropical zones. And Congo, with the Congo River right there, could be a very wealthy country, except that at the mouth of that river there are great rapids, and so it's not navigable. We cannot take a ship up into the Congo. And so the port of, like we were in Benin or in Angola, much of the transit goes through there where we have good dockage, or you can get on the river. This ship cannot go to those places because there's no docking. You saw we were at container ports and dusty industrial areas because there's no other place for a large ship to land. The other issue of Africa is the great population rise. They expect another 500 million to even more in the next couple of generations. Now this is in contrast to Europe, Americas, Asia, where the population is already either level or in negative terms. So some people said the future of the world is African, but actually what it means is we'll have to cooperate more, or else aid, or try to make the world better with this population bulge coming. And then it's predicted to, the human population is predicted to go dramatically down in another century. But I can't wait till then. I have to get through traffic now. And so you come to these places and you see the vibrancy of the people, particularly the very young population. The median age for West Africa is about 22 years old. The median age of much of the rest of the world is over 50. And the median age here is ever 18, right? Well, later in the day. But if you, yesterday we went and saw the market, and there's an economy that is very rudimentary. There may be some cash, but a lot of it's bartering, and now it has become microfinance on the phone, and so the technological telecom ability has transformed many places where people do their business just on their phone. They won't have a bank account. They don't have a telephone line, but suddenly they have this thing that they can watch the world on. And this has made big difference in particularly rural areas, where now you can see about things and you want to move to the city and trade something. So my son Robin, who's been working in Gabon, says that the Beninese are the ones who travel and peddle stuff. And a lot of it is this beautiful cloth, the kanta, or the different robes, and you see there's quite elaborate clothing. But above all, you see all these kids. This one is going to go to play soccer in Paris someday. And so the energy of the youth is quite fantastic, and their cheerfulness, in spite of what little they may have, is indication of sort of the continuity of their culture in spite of all its trouble, perhaps. And then the elders are sitting back wondering what happened, because some of them remember long ago, and they have stories and such, much of it not written down. Now they take oral history to try to get the memory while they can. One writer called Africa is a land of always becoming and always forgetting. The ancient stories, the traditional skills have been replaced by new generation who don't want to hear anything about it. And so what interesting way to see the development of these areas is through some of their contemporary artists. And here's one from Ghana, El Anatsui, who is featured in, for instance, at the Tate Museum in London and represented by the October Gallery. But he takes wood and cloth and makes these sort of screens and then quilts. And then most famously, he takes bottle tops and he makes great screens of it. And again, at the Tate Modern, they had a elaborate piece that was a gigantic curtain covering one of the great interior spaces like this. So it's sort of naturalistic and raw, but also contemporary at the same time. And another artist of interest is this fellow, Ramol Hadzuome, who is from Benin. And he was so interested in the transport of goods in the countryside on things like this motorcycle, which would carry bags of vegetable oil, sell them out in the country. And then people could carry tremendous loads like this. That's quite a commute. And then he started making art out of the discarded plastic cans. And these are ubiquitous. Some of them traditionally would have been a big gourd or a bladder that would be used for, but he would take these use petrol cans and stuff and dress them up as masks. So I just show you this as sort of an example of the vibrancy of some of the visual arts, much less the music, which you can hear. But it looks like somebody I used to know. But they're quite fantastic. And this is actually, the wrapping is a Yoruba tradition where you use cloth to make objects and doll. I believe that the art class here is practicing that, the Yoruba style cloth sculpture. And again, somebody I once met somewhere. But anyway, I'm going to go on just to Sao Tome and Principe, because this is sort of an unusual little place most people don't go. When you take a regular tour of Africa, you're going from Cairo to maybe Nairobi and maybe to South Africa, but you're flying, and maybe there's hardly any long distance transportation in across Central Africa. I'll talk a bit about the railroad they're building from Angola to Kenya on another day, sea day. But meanwhile, we're coming along here. Now that's Ghana, that's Benin, and they all have the African colors, the green, the yellow, and red in their flag. And then Cameroon over here. The biggest country of all is Nigeria, with over 180 million people, and also a delta of various rivers which make, there's no port to land in Nigeria, but we're just missing a great traffic jam there. But these islands are just off of Cameroon. Bioko is part of Cameroon, but because of the Portuguese inheritance, these two countries were given their independence peacefully, and they declared that they don't want to be part of all those other countries. And other ones like Anabon is part of Gabon, and so this is a volcanic chain that goes back into geologic time, but that's why these little islands are there lined up. The small one is Ilha de Principe with Ilha Bonbon, where I was a number of years ago, but we're going down to Sao Tome in the main capital, Santa Cruz here. So these are mainly former plantations with mountains in the center and dense forests. But people come here because there's no malaria, and it's also relatively unpopulated, and they don't have any coup d'etat. They just have more coffee or something. And but they're famous for their cacao plantations and processing and making some chocolate. So that's one of the tours is going to one of these places where you'll get a taste of that. Have you ever had chocolate before? I recommend it, but not for breakfast. Anyway, this is, as we come in, I mean, this is a real island apart from the rest of Africa, but then again, the vegetation and some of the animal life is similar. But we're coming in to a fair-sized town with a good dockage, so when we're there, we can walk right into town. It's not very big. It has its old Portuguese fortress, and then over the town you can see the districts of the cathedral and some of the colonial buildings. But it's a very pleasant place, but not a big bustling development like we've just seen. And so the charm is in the colonial heritage and some of the museums, and go into the church. There's a city tour, or you can just go walk on your own. So it's sort of a Portuguese town in paradise, though there are almost no Portuguese left. They've all gone home pretty much. And but the people speak Portuguese in addition to their original language. Many of the residents were brought as slaves to work on the plantation by the Portuguese. So they're a mixed group from Angola, Cameroon, Ghana, and the Gold Coast that populated this town, or the islands, of which there are about 150,000 people on both of the islands, the little islands. So a lot of it's low level and pretty quiet, let's say. But here's the central market in Santa Cruz. So there's still a lot of produce, but the main economy is exporting cacao or finished chocolate. In olden days, they used to collect precious shells that were traded for other goods on the mainland, because that was a currency. Like the cowrie shell became like wampum. It was the object that was the monetary exchange. And so you'll see, even yesterday in the market, we saw some of these shells that were sort of honorific, and they had such value they were used as money. But this is more delicious cacao. And so if you haven't seen those plants, they're a tree that has a pod that grows off the branch and can be picked annually. And so that's the main economy until recently, when tourism became the other part of the economy just because they're beautiful beaches, no pollution to speak of, and you can go and find a little place to stay, and it's all a little bit of, not quite like the Galapagos because it's much more tropical, but it has beautiful reefs and now villas out on various points so you can go around to see things. So tourism has become, like many places, a major industry which helps to preserve either the culture or perhaps the natural beauty of the area rather than what's happening in Congo and other places where there's mass deforestation, displacement of the indigenous people living there, and civil war. And so the troubles of Africa are many, but they're not here. And so you can go to this the sacred island, Ilha Santana, if you can climb that well. But this is Ilha Bonbon, which has a resort on it, and so you can. This is on the north side. We're not going to that particular island, but I was there a few years ago and just took the picture. Oh, just notice, cuidado, cuidado, piso. So if you don't speak Portuguese, you might slip and fall. But people come from the city to go work in these resorts now. So a lot of them are rustic, some of them are very fancy. They have an international airport with flights from Europe, and so this has become the new thing. You can work in a hotel and have a wage. You're no longer just working on the plantation. And so the people are particularly friendly and happy to see us. But the real attraction of the island is hiking into the rather steep interior, which has a lot of waterfalls and old growth trees still, but it's not tigers and lions and, or rather elephants and the mainland wildlife. It's mainly for birding and for sort of botanical studies, let's say. But fantastically, they have these volcanic peaks that were evidence of the volcanic origin of the islands, and particularly this one, the Pico Sal Grande, which sort of is a monument in the land. So it's kind of surreal valleys and canyons in the center of these islands. And if you're a birder, I'll show you a few of the endemic ones, the Sao Tome spinetail, and then the blue-bellied roller. So if you have binoculars and you go out on a trip, you probably get pointed out some of these. And then on the shore, you have the tropic birds and frigate birds and a lot of ocean birds, the red-billed tropic bird. Now, this is a bird that flies from here up to Russia and flies back, and then it goes south to South Africa. So some of these sort of seabirds and tropical birds are great migratory creatures that go farther than we can imagine. The stay-at-home alternative is the gray parrot. It doesn't go anywhere. It just talks to you. Then you may have seen this bird that's common through South Africa and a lot of Africa. It's the weaver bird, which spend all their life making a nest like this. And they're oblivious of anybody other than perhaps a predator. So they hang their nests off of trees where they can't be gotten by hungry tourists like this guy, the Mona monkey, which was a mainland monkey that came somehow to the islands. It's the only large primate on Sao Tome Principe, but it's pretty charming. At least it got a nice haircut. So these, you may see this, but these are out in the hillsides and shy creatures, but they're still happy to see you. So I'm going to leave you just the last view of some of the tropical interior of Sao Tome, and again, the waters that nourish this land and rejuvenate it. I mean, it has, since the plantation time, the island has sort of regrown much of it, and so it looks as wild as perhaps when the first Portuguese and the first Africans came here. And so this is the interest of coming here, just to sort of see a precursor to what, if you go to other parts of Africa, you see tales of destruction compared to a reserve like this. It's also a marine preserve, so they keep the international fishing fleets away. So that's a general benefit, because much of African ocean waters have been cleaned out by the global pirate fishing trade. But life is renewed, and water is the essence of it. So I'm just going to give you a couple of sayings about the sea. The sea, forever starting and restarting, said Paul Valéry. And another saying from oculaire. The sea drives truth into a person like salt. And another saying, those who would go to sea for pleasure should go to hell for a vacation. That's an old British comment about, oh, you're going to go on a cruise, you'll never make it back. Anyway, that was the olden days. And then another one of George Herbert, which is someone that would want to learn how to pray should go to sea. Now, of course, on this ship we have all services, and we don't need to pray except for lunch. Oh, yes, okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being with you on board. Look forward to talking to you. Thank you very much.